Hey everyone, this is Friedel Hagaraja Rave, and I'm here with my recap and review of the Gilded Age season number 1, episode number 6, titled Heads Have Rolled for Less, which is basically a line that Aunt Agnes ends up stuck as saying to Bannister, but we'll get to it. And yeah, this was another enjoyable episode, and I was going through the ratings for the show over on Wikipedia, and it turns out that the viewership is actually increasing weekly, which, you know what, I'm here for it. More people need to start watching this enjoyable show. It is very different from Downton Abbey, even though the creator is the same. But yeah, this episode opens up with Mr. and Mrs. Russell, along with Mr. Russell's right hand man Clay, going to look at the wreckage because there was a train accident that we got to know about in the previous episode. And yeah, they were injured, and 5 men died. But Miss Burton is there, and everyone is basically a bit relieved by the fact that at least no women and children died. And yeah, this is where Mr. Russell ends up giving Miss Burton more money for the Red Cross, and she's very happy about it. And she's like, Mrs. Russell, if you aren't able to make it to the next meeting, I understand that. And Mr. Russell is like, no, 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 she will be there because they still have to make appearances, and Mrs. Russell still wants to improve her standing when it comes to polite society and all of that stuff. So yeah, they're like, you know what, Miss Burton, we are very grateful for what you're doing here and whatnot. And then there's a photographer from the Globe, I guess, and and Clay is like, well, he would like a picture for with you, Mr. and Mrs. Russell. And Mr. Russell is like, you know what, let's do it, because if we don't allow him to take a picture of us, then he might say that we are hiding and whatnot. So the picture and news, of course, they make the morning news, and Aunt Agnes is reading the newspaper, and she's like, 5 people died. That's not a lot. And Ada is like, Agnes, think about their families and whatnot. And yeah, as far as Mrs. Van Ryan is concerned, Mr. Russell is to blame for the accident, and Midian is like, how is he to blame for a train accident? Yes, he is the boss, but it's not his blame. It's not his blame to take. And Mrs. Van Ryan is like, oh yeah, okay, if you say so. So Ada ends up changing the subject, and they have to go to Miss Burton's meeting. And yeah, Midian is like, well, Mrs. Russell will be there too. And yeah, Mrs. Van Ryan, she still doesn't like Mrs. Russell being there, and I think this was a scene where she was like, you know what, or maybe I think, or maybe it was, yeah, I think it comes later. But there's the scene where Mrs. Van Ryan basically says that you stop these people from coming through the door, they'll try and enter through the window. You block the window, and they'll enter through the chimney. It was very very well delivered. But anyway, these all of them are talking about. The upcoming meeting with Miss Burton and whatnot, and then this is where Ada is like, well, I got written to, and yeah, there's this drama going on with the Academy of Music, and Miriam is like, why can't they just let opera house more rooms in the opera houses and more performance and whatnot? And yeah, as far as Mrs. Ren Ryan is concerned, she doesn't like change. She wants the past to be the past because apparently, as far as she's concerned, it's the last bastion of polite society and whatnot. But yeah, moving on. We cut to Mr. Russell. He's going through the news, and yeah, his secretary comes in, and she's like, you know what? You aren't in any danger right now, publicly speaking, as far as your image is concerned, because Miss Burton ended up giving a good quote about how you're very, very disheartened about the entire thing. And Mr. Russell was like, yeah, I am disheartened, and but they still need to get to the bottom of how the train ended up going off track in the first place, why the accident even occurred. And Clay is like, you know what? I'll check stuff. I'll check into it. So Peggy is going out with Miriam, and she asks Mrs. Armstrong if she wants something from the market because she's going out. And Mrs. Armstrong continues to ignore Peggy, and even the cook is like, "Why are you like that with Miss Peggy?" And Miss Armstrong is like, "Well, as far as I am concerned, I think that she is trying to remind me that I'm very very old now, and I'm not young enough to handle the jobs that are given to me and whatnot." And yeah, the cook is like, "Well, it's all in your head, Mrs. Armstrong." So Miriam and Peggy are walking, and this is where my bad. That was a loud cough. I might end up coughing in this episode. Who knows? But yeah, these two are talking, and this is where they end up talking about Mr. Rakes. And Miriam is like, well, I'm still confused about Mr. Rakes. And yeah, Peggy is like, you know what, Miriam? Yes, he's handsome, he's young, he is successful, but you know what? I don't think that he actually has a plan about what he wants to do next. And Miriam is like, I think you might have a point. And yeah, if you think about it, I am side-eyeing Mr. Rakes a bit because I still can't get a read on him, what he really wants. And considering the time that we are in, the fact that he ended up kissing Miriam just like that in front of her hotel room door, where anyone could have seen them kiss and talk and rumors. I'm like, when Mr. Rakes, are you not concerned about upholding Miriam's reputation in society? What's happening here? So we cut to the cook, and she is giving the money that she owes Aunt Ada, and Aunt Ada is like, you know what? If it becomes too much of a hassle, I need you to tell me because you are paying your debt slowly, and it might end up burdening your finances and whatnot. And the cook is like, no, 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 I want to repay my debt, so it's okay. And you can actually see Bannister in the background looking at this. He doesn't necessarily know what's happening, but he is intrigued. So we cut to the meeting, the Red Cross meeting, and Mrs. Morris is there. And of course, Mrs. Morris isn't happy about the fact that Mrs. Russell will be making her way to the meeting as well, because as far as Mrs. Morris is concerned, Mr. Russell ended up killing her husband, and he ended up killing those 5 people that died in the train crash and whatnot. And Mrs. Russell walks in, and yeah, Mrs. Russell is like, well, I'm here. And yeah, Mrs. Morris isn't happy because she feels that she's being pushed out because of her husband's death, and her place is being taken by Mrs. Russell. And yeah, everyone puts it to a vote about whether or not Mrs. Russell should be part of the board. And of course, Mrs. Fane ends up saying yes. Miriam ends up saying yes. Burton ends up saying yes. And the other women don't say yes. But this is where Miss Burton is like, I would like to remind you that Mrs. Russell is the only one who has done a lot when it comes to supporting the Red Cross. And yeah, they need her money. They need her, yeah, not necessarily influence right now, but they need her money. So the rest of the women also vote yes. And Mrs. Morris walks up. Yes, she stands up and she's like, I won't be part of this group anymore. You guys have lost your values. And because you are chasing money and whatnot, so I'm leaving. And I'm like, you know what, Mrs. Morris, I don't give a hoot. You're basically very prejudiced against Peggy, so bye bye. So everyone is talking about how they should take a break after the drama that ended up being exhibited by Mrs. Morris, and they're like, yeah, good idea. So everyone walks together, and we get this group. There's Peggy, there's Burton, Miriam, and Mrs. Fane, and this is where Clara Burton ends up asking Miriam if she ended up talking to Mrs. Chamberlain, and Aurora Fane is like, I thought you might have forgotten about it, and Clara is like, no, 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 no. When it comes to asking for money and support for the Red Cross, I will ask everyone. And Miriam is like, you know what? I'll do it. I'll talk to Mrs. Chamberlain. So moving on. This is another scene. Again, this show has been showcasing the different worlds that Miriam and Peggy have to deal with, and because it's time for them to go home, but not necessarily Peggy, because Peggy needs to go to the newspaper because the boss wants to talk to her. And yeah, Miriam ends up halting a carriage, and the carriage person is like, yeah, the driver is like, I'll take you, Miriam, but I won't be taking her, which is basically Peggy, and he basically trots off. And Peggy is like, well, Miriam, I think you just ended up experiencing the injustice that I get to experience every day, and the type of injustice that I grew up with. And Miriam is like, why don't you fight, huh? Why don't you fight the injustices that you face? And Peggy is like, well, I don't have the time. If I end up fighting every bigot that comes my way, I won't be able to do the stuff that I want to do in my life. And she's like, you know what? How I handle this situation? I end up trying to stop a carriage, and if the carriage actually stops for me, it means that the person is going to take me. So this is where Peggy ends up trying to halt a carriage. One of the carriages passes, it doesn't stop, and then another one stops in front of Peggy. And yeah, I'm actually liking how the writers are handling Miriam's perspective opening, and basically her becoming more aware of how people like Peggy from that community end up living a life in New York during this time. So we cut to Aurora and Bertha, and this is where Aurora tells Bertha that, you know what, I have to give you some news, but it also comes with a warning. So it turns out that Ward McAllister would like luncheon at the Russell's house, and Bertha is like, okay, I guess I'm ready. And Aurora is like, well, you better be, because he won't be giving you another chance, and you need to make sure that everything is presented in an English style. And Bertha is like, yeah, I think I can manage this. So Peggy is at the newspaper office, and yeah, the boss is very, very happy because article on Clara Burton ended up being a huge hit. The subscriber numbers are up and whatnot. Everyone is happy. And yeah, the boss is like, well, because you are someone who's giving us something very different, because it's not every day that people like us, they end up having access to people like Clara Burton. So yeah, Peggy is very happy with the success of her article. Then we cut to Bertha and she's talking to her help. We have Mr. Boudoir, we have Mrs. Bruce, and we have Mr. Church, and she's telling them that that Ward McAllister will be coming over, and she wants everything to be English, even the food. However, she's like, you know what, the main course can be French, but everything else needs to be English. And she's like, Mr. Cook, can you handle it? Can you make everything be presented on the table in an English manner? Mr. Cook is like, Mr. Church, not Cook. Mr. Church is like, yeah, I think I can manage it. And I really like the fact that I think it was in the previous episode or in the episode before that we actually saw Mr. Bannister and Mr. Church talk about the differences between an English style presentation and an American style presentation. So I like the fact how that particular storyline ended up coming up again in this episode. So as everyone is walking away, Bertha is walking away, Mrs. Bruce goes after her and she's like, Mrs. Bruce, I think that you should know that the Van Ryan's butler is English. So maybe we could ask him for help to help Mr. Church out. And Bertha is like, yeah, that's a good plan. I leave it to you. So we cut to Peggy, and she went to meet her mom, and her mom is playing the piano because I guess it turns out, if I remember correctly, that it turns out that she gives piano lessons, and her students are going to arrive any second. And she's like, Peggy, if you were coming over, you should have told me. I should have prepared something to eat, and I would have even postponed the class. And Peggy's like, no, I'm here just for a quick meeting. So basically, Peggy tells her mom that she doesn't want her coming over to the Van Ryan house and talking to Miriam about the family problems. And even though Peggy's mom is very, very happy about the article that Peggy wrote, she's like, yeah, but your father wasn't very enthused about it. And Peggy is like, yeah, I figured, because my father doesn't want me to pursue such a career where he's like, you know what, this isn't going to lead to anything. And she's like, and Peggy's mom is like, we are a family, we have to work through this. And Peggy is like, I could work it through with you, but I guess dad is a lost cause. And she walks away. So we cut to Mr. and Mrs. Russell, and this is where they're having a conversation, because Mrs. Russell is like, well, Ward McAllister is going to come over for luncheon, and Mr. Russell is like, well, I have my own issues, about with the train, and it turns out that the axles were of poor quality, they were old, so someone is trying to sabotage my company from the inside and whatnot. And Mrs. Russell is like, well, you will be able to handle this, right, George? And George is like, yeah, I think so. And I think this is also where he ends up raising his voice, because he's like, I have more pressing issues than your whatever that luncheon is with Ward McAllister. And then he apologizes, and Bertha is like, well, I know what I want, and Mr. Ward is going to get me what I want. So I want you to support me and whatnot. And yeah, this is where George is like, yeah, I will do that. And yeah, we get to find out that Mrs. Russell is of course going through Gladys's letters, and it turns out that Archie Baldwin ended up sending a letter to Gladys again, and this is where these two again have a conversation about Gladys's future. And Bertha's like, well, I need you to talk to our daughter, and George, please don't grow soft. Please don't grow soft. And he's like, yeah, because I guess no one can say that about you, because I think he wants Bertha to be soft. And I'm like, Bertha is soft. She is soft when she wants to be, but right now she wants a very, very strong husband. So hopefully George will be able to give her that. So George ends up going to he goes and talks to Gladys, and Gladys is like, well, what the heck do you want with me and with my personal life? Am I ever going to get married? Because I do know, because from the it turns out that Archie ended up confessing in the letter that George is the one who ended up giving him no option, and saying that he needs to cut off any communication with Gladys. And Mr. Russell's like, yes, I did that, but I also made it very hard for him to refuse, and he just wants his daughter to realize that she's very, very special, even though she doesn't think that she's special, and that her parents have something very, very grand planned for her. So we cut to the aunts and Miriam, and this is where these two are talking about the upcoming luncheon with Mrs. Russell. And yeah, Agnes is like, do you really have to go? And Miriam is like, well, I could have gone without telling you, And Ada's like, yeah, she could have. Okay, so yeah, now I remember. I think this is where Agnes ends up talking about, you try and stop these people from coming through the door. They come through the window. You close the windows. They come through the chimneys. So they're talking about Mrs. Russell, and then Agnes is like, okay, so will Mr. Tom Ricks will be there too? And Miriam is like, yeah, he will be there. And Agnes is like, well, I did warn you. As far as I can tell, that the read that I have on his personality, he is an adventurer, and with the rate that he's going and he's moving through society, he is going to go on and try and attract the next glittery thing. And Marion is like, no, 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 Mr. Rakes isn't like that. You're wrong. Ada's like, well, I'm never wrong. And Marion is like, well, you are now. And I'm like, Marion, maybe your aunt has a point. But yeah, let's see. And Ada doesn't like Agnes's tone either, but there's nothing she can do about it. So we got to the help downstairs, and this is where Mr. Bannister asks the cook about what she was talking to Miss Ada about, and the cook is like, no, 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 nothing, nothing. It's nothing to concern you about. And this is where they get a letter, and it's addressed to Mr. Bannister, and he opens it, and it's basically an invitation to come over to the Russell's house in order to help Mr. Church. And Mrs. Armstrong is like, well, are you going to go? And Mr. Bannister is like, well, I have to go because I'm curious about it. And before he leaves, Mrs. Armstrong ends up talking about Peggy and how she's worried that Peggy's articles might end up being traced back to Mrs. Van Ryan and cause trouble for the family. And she's just worried, and Bannister is like, of course you're just worried. So we cut to the Russells having lunch, and Larry talks about how he has been invited over for a doll tea party, and he wants Gladys to be there. And Bertha's like, Gladys not going. And Larry is like, well, she should, because Miss Astor is going to be there, one of Miss Astor's daughters, and other people will be there, young women that Gladys should be acquainted with and whatnot. And he just wants her to go. And even Robert chimes in, and Bertha, because yeah, she's like, I guess I can let Gladys go because again, Miss Astor would be here, and Bertha wants to be connected to Mrs. Astor, whatever it takes. Okay, so yeah, I skipped an image. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so Mr. Bannister goes to the Russell's house, and he ends up talking to Mr. Boudoir, and he ends up talking to Mr. Church, and this is where he ends up telling them about, yes, there are going to be very, very different things that you need to be concerned about when it comes to an English style presentation versus an American style presentation. And yeah, Mr. Boudoir and Mr. Church are worried, and Mr. Bannister is like, you know what, I will send over some suggestions for the food that you should prepare with the French main course, and I'll help you out. I'll help you out because I think that the luncheon is on Friday, so they have a few days. So we got to the tea doll party, which is very, very. It's kind of creepy, I have to say. It's kind of creepy seeing these grown adults basically participating in a tea party in such a manner. And they end up meeting Mrs. Fish, and then they end up seeing Miss Astor, and she's all alone. She's crying all alone, and Larry ends up introducing his sister to Miss Astor, and he walks away. And I'm like, Larry, really, really, why not sit with Miss Astor? Now there are some viewers who think that Larry might be a closeted character, but let's see if that's true or not. So Miss Astor and Gladys end up forming a friendship because Miss Astor was crying, and Gladys asked what she's crying about, and she's like, well, it's because of my mom, and my mom is putting a lot of pressure on me. And Gladys is like, well, tell me about it, sis. And this is where Gladys is like, well, my mom doesn't want me to marry someone I like. And Miss Astor is like, well, it's the same story for me. She doesn't want me to marry this man I like. He is very successful, he is smart, he is handsome, and whatnot. And I'm like, Miss Astor, are you talking about Mr. Rakes? Is there a chance that you're talking about Mr. Rakes? Because this could be a weird drama thing that Miss Astor ends up proposing to Mr. Rakes or wants him, and Mr. Rakes, yeah, he might end up marrying or being engaged to Miss Astor because he wants to climb the social ladder. But let's see what happens. So Bannister ends up looking at the utensils being displayed being presented on the table, and he ends up picking mistakes and whatnot. And yeah, Bertha is noticing all of this, and Bertha walks in, and Bertha is like, oh, Mr. Church, it's my fault that I made you do all of this because I ended up asking you a favor concerning something that you won't be able to do. So she ends up offering Mr. Bannister the position for a butler for just one day on Friday, the 18th. And Mr. Bannister is like, me, madam? And she's like, yeah, Mrs. Van Ryan won't be an issue, right? And Bannister is like, well, she could be. And yeah, Mrs. Van Ryan, not Mrs. Van Ryan, my bad. Mrs. Russell ends up offering Bannister $100 just for one day. And Bannister is like, yeah, yeah, I'll do it. And of course, Mr. Church isn't happy about it because he feels that he's being replaced, and that ends up playing a role for down the line. So Bannister ends up talking to Jack, and he's like, Jack, I will be out on Friday, so I want you to be the butler and serve food to the Van Ryan sisters. And Jack is like, I can't handle this. And Bannister's like, you'll be okay, you'll be just fine. So Peggy and Marion are walking, and they end up meeting Larry. And Larry wants to tell Marion something, and Peggy walks a few steps back and she to check the flowers. And this is where Larry tells Marion that he's actually interested in architecture, even though his father wants him to be a banker. He is into architecture, and he is asking Mr. White for a job. And Marion is very impressed by Larry and how he's trying to pave a path for himself. And yeah, as far as Mr. White is concerned, if you guys don't know, if you Google him, Mr. White, back in the days, he was involved in this very unfortunate sex scandal, from what I can remember. So I'm looking forward to seeing whether or not the writers will be tackling that part of his character. So yeah, again, Larry and Miriam, I do like them. I do think that the writers should focus more on their interactions. But again, the theory that Larry might be closeted, who knows if it ends up being true. So Miriam ends up meeting Mrs. Chamberlain, and Mrs. Chamberlain is very, very appreciative of Miriam because she's the only one in New York City who is still willing to be connected with her. And Mrs. Chamberlain is like, well, you know what, Miriam, you do know about my past, right? And Miriam is like, well, I only know about what other people say. And this is where Mrs. Chamberlain tells Miriam the truth about how she was with, I think his name was Jonathan or whatnot, while his first wife was still alive. And yeah, she just likes Marion and how she thinks. And Marion is like, well, I am in a bit of a situation as well because my aunts aren't necessarily very into the man that I want to marry or that I like. And Mrs. Chamberlain is like, you know what, I'll help you out. Why don't you invite the young man, Mr. Rikes, over here to my house, and you can sit down and have a proper conversation with him to see whether or not you guys are actually compatible, and if you can start a life together. And Marion is like, why would you do this for me? And Mrs. Chamberlain is like, well, you're the only one who ended up giving me respect after my husband died, because it turns out that while her husband was alive, other women were still tolerating Mrs. Chamberlain, still talking to her and whatnot. But after her husband died, no one basically wanted to talk to her. She was ostracized from society. So it turns out that Miss Astor has been invited over to Gladys's to meet Gladys, and Bertha, of course, she's very excited about it. And she's like, "Oh, Miss Astor, how are you?" and whatnot. And Miss Astor is like, "Well, I'm just here to see whether or not Gladys can accompany me to this party over at my house." And Bertha is like, "No, she isn't out yet." And Miss Astor is like, "Well, she will be out, right? So why don't we have this function? And this house is great for a ball, and we can host this function, and we can ask dancers to come in and whatnot." And Bertha is very into this idea, especially because it's coming from Miss Astor, because Bertha is trying to find a way to get connected with Miss Astor, just to meet her. And as Bertha is walking away, she ends up listening to what the girls are talking about in the room. And of course, Gladys is very excited about the fact that Bertha is allowing her to do something when it comes to her debutante ball, not ball, debutante ball. And yeah, Bertha is happy because, yeah, as far as she's concerned, her plan is working. So Bannister ends up talking to Mrs. Van Ryan about needing a day off, and Mrs. Van Ryan is, really, at lunchtime? What type of lawyer are you meeting with? Doesn't the lawyer want to eat his lunch? And Bannister is like, no, it's a legal problem, blah, yada, yada, yada. The lawyer doesn't eat lunch. And Ada comes in and she's like, oh, is the lawyer a Muslim by any chance? Is it Ramadan already? Ada is a mess. So Miriam is getting ready, and Ada ends up telling Miriam that, you know what, Agnes just had a little argument with Bannister, and she doesn't want Miriam to talk about Mrs. Russell because she doesn't want Agnes to be annoyed any further. And Miriam is like, yeah, I won't mention it. So Agnes is getting ready, and Mrs. Armstrong is helping her, and this is where Mrs. Armstrong brings up Peggy again, and she's like, you know what, Mrs. Van Ryan, I'm worried about Peggy's articles coming back to hurt you and whatnot. And Agnes is like, I won't hear another word from you, because as far as I'm concerned, you actually have a problem with Miss Peggy, and you have prejudice towards her, and I want you to stop. Okay, I have warned you. And I'm like, yep. Tell her to shut up whenever she brings up Peggy. in such a manner. So George is talking to Clay, and even though they ended up talking, having Pinkerton men on the case, they aren't necessarily able to find a lot this quickly. But Clay is like, you know what, we are coming close. We are coming close. So it's time for Mr. Ward McAllister to come over. Bannister is checking everything, and Mr. Church doesn't like it. And Mr. Church is like, you know what? I'll just be back. And Mr. Boudoir is like, where are you going? He's like, I'll be back. I'll be back. And again, I think the show wants us to think that he's the one who ended up sending the letter to the Van Ryan house, but it could be someone else. It could be someone else. So of course Jack is freaking out because it's time for him to serve luncheon to the Agnes sisters, and yeah, he is worried, and yeah, the girl is like, you'll do great, Jack. You will do great. So Miriam ends up going to the Russell house, and she ends up noticing Bannister, and she's like, Bannister, what the heck are you doing here? Bannister is like, yeah, I'm helping Mrs. Russell, and it's a secret. And Miriam's like, okay, your secret's safe from me. So Walt McAllister comes in, and everyone is getting to know each other. He ends up bringing up Catherine the Great, and Bertha doesn't understand what he's talking about. So Aurora Fane comes in with a safe, and I'm like, good. She's becoming a good friend to Bertha. So Miriam and Tom are talking, and Tom is like, I would like to meet more. I would like to meet more of you and whatnot. And Miriam is like, I think we can figure that out. So yeah, Bertha really went all the way when it comes to this luncheon, and she ended up having these gifts presented on the table, and of course Ward is very very impressed, and Bertha's like, I hope I didn't overstep it, and Ward is like, well, as far as I'm concerned, nothing is too much. So it's time for Jack to serve dinner, to serve lunch, and yeah, Agnes is like, you know what? We are going to tell Bannister that you ended up flying the test with flying colors because I don't want him to experience the satisfaction of the fact that we missed him. And Jack, he makes some mistakes, but overall, I think he's doing well. So as they're eating lunch, a letter comes in, and Agnes opens the note, and she reads it, and she's like, this is enough." So basically, in the note, the note tells Agnes that Bannister is over at the Russells' house, helping them with luncheon and then whatnot. And of course, Agnes is very very angry, and she acts practically like she just storms into the Russell house. And I really like the scene where when she walks through the door, she's actually quite taken back when she looks at the grandeur of the interiors and the richness and the money and whatnot. But she's like, she remembers what she came here for, and she ends up going to the dining area, and she walks in, and everyone is surprised to see her. And she's like, and Miriam and Aurora end up coming in with a save, and they're like, "Oh, she must have read the clock wrong. She was just coming in to check on us and to meet Mr. Ward very quickly because she's a very busy woman, and she must have thought that we were all in the drawing room right now." And yeah, Agnes is like, "Yes, that's exactly what happened. I misread the clock. So if you guys excuse me, I need to go back." And as she walks out of the dining room, she turns to Bannister, and she's like, "Heads have rolled for less." So Oscar is talking to Miss Hunter, and Miss Hunter is the one who tells Oscar that, you know what, if you want to come closer to Gladys, even though Bertha runs the house, George loves Gladys. So if you are able to befriend George and show him support right now because he needs it, then he might end up warming up to you and even be okay with you marrying Gladys. And yeah, Oscar is like, what do you mean? What kind of trouble is he in? And Miss Hunter is like, well, I don't know, but he needs support right now. He's vulnerable. And yeah, Oscar is like, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. And of course, he ends up giving Miss Hunter the money that was owed. And as he's walking Miss Hunter back to the Russell's house, this is where Mrs. Armstrong ends up seeing these two, and she's like, it looks like Oscar and Miss Hunter are having an affair. So Miriam ends up talking to Peggy at nighttime, and she's like, "Well, I feel ashamed. I feel embarrassed in myself. I feel bad for Aunt Agnes, and it's just that she isn't necessarily very willing to change because things are changing around her, and she's stuck in her old ways." And Peggy's like, "Well, why don't you help her find a new place in this changing world?" And Miriam was like, "Well, it's easier said than done." So Jack ends up telling Bannister that, you know what, everything went well, and this is where Bannister tells his people that Mrs. Van Ryan hasn't said anything to me. She isn't talking to me, so I'm not really sure what's going to happen next. But he is like, you know what, but I have to figure out who sent that note. So Mrs. Armstrong is helping Agnes with going to bed, and this is where she's like, "Oh, madam, it must be too much going through all of these betrayals." And Agnes is like, "What do you mean, these betrayals? What happened? Spit it out." And yeah, this is where Mrs. Armstrong ends up telling Agnes about the affair. Now, we don't necessarily know if she actually tells her that it's Miss Hunter and Oscar, or if Miss Hunter is having an affair with someone from the house. But Agnes, yeah, the news really shakes Agnes, and she's like, leave me right now." And Agnes, yeah, this episode could have been retitled Betraying Aunt Agnes, because she ends up getting betrayed twice because of what Bannister did, and Miriam isn't listening to her when it comes to becoming closer to Mr. Rakes. And then we have Oscar going around and paying Miss Hunter to share tea on what happens in the Russell house and how he can get closer to Gladys. So it's a lot happening, a lot has happening, and yeah, only 3 more episodes left. So let's see what happens next. And the episode ends up with Mr. Russell being very, very worried, and Bertha is like, "Okay, so what happened?" And Mr. Russell is like, "Well, they found a dude who ended up installing those low quality axles in the train. His name's Dixon." And Bertha's like, "Well, that's good, right? We can send him to jail and put him to trial and whatnot." And George is like, "No, it's not going to be that easy, because he ended up confessing that I was the one who gave him the order to use the low quality axles." And Bertha's like, "Well, that's preposterous. That's impossible." And he's like, "Yep, he has proof. He has written proof." And yeah, they are in trouble right now. And maybe Oscar will swoop in with an assist. Who knows? Who knows? But yeah, this is where the episode ends. And yeah, 3 more episodes left. So I'm really, really interested in seeing what's going to happen next. Let me know what you thought of the episode down in the comment section below. Do you think that Miriam should trust Mr. Rakes? I don't know. I really don't know. But yeah, let me know what you thought. Until next time, stay happy, stay safe, stay blessed. See you guys later. Bye.